Deterrence, failure, and war. This is a lecture that is foundational because when countries go to war, they typically do it after doing a calculation of the relative strength of their opponent. And very often countries are attacked because they failed to make preparations against an aggressor state. And so deterrence failure is a good locus for looking at this dyadic relationship between two countries, whether the country is the attacker or the attacked. It's also foundational because very often when people describe a conflict, they do it in terms of deterrence, but without thinking clearly about the implications. So this is an early lecture in the study of the causes of war for good reason, because almost every single war can be described in part by some of the processes that are described by the theories of deterrence. So deterrence is basically at the dyadic level. It's not quite at the systemic level where you've got a community of states, but it's the relationship between two states, and often a few other states if they're providing deterrence to their ally. So the theory of deterrence predicts not war, but it actually predicts peace. It tries to argue that countries, when they're strong, are able to keep other countries from attacking them. Historically, it's very important. A lot of the research about deterrence has been about how major powers, particularly the US, can use nuclear weapons to protect its smaller allies in places as far as Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. So you can imagine during the Cold War, the US and the USSR spent a lot of effort trying to protect their allies. The Soviet Union provided security guarantees to Cuba. The US provided security guarantees to Japan and South Korea and Taiwan, to NATO in Europe, and to select allies in other parts of the world as well. And occasionally there were deterrence failures where one country attacked another, despite the fact that these major powers extended protection to these smaller countries. And there are all sorts of paradoxes where weaker countries attacked stronger countries, sometimes winning, sometimes losing, but nevertheless leaving the puzzle of how do we understand when a country will choose to attack and when does deterrence fail. So let's begin with a definition. Deterrence is basically dissuasion by threat. It works by threatening a cost on an attacker great enough so that they won't attack. So if you attack me, I will inflict a cost on you so great you will not be willing to go to war because you're not going to be able to recoup those losses by conquering me or by continuing the fighting. So the goal is therefore to keep war from happening rather than necessarily winning a war. So you could have a country that's not strong enough to win the war, but strong enough to inflict a heavy cost. So, we can imagine a country like Switzerland in the Second World War. If Germany had attacked Switzerland, they almost certainly would have won, but it would have been a major diversion of resources from other fronts. So Switzerland's deterrence was sufficient to keep it from getting attacked. Other neighbors of Germany, like Holland and Belgium and Denmark, Czechoslovakia, were not strong enough. So deterrence in some cases may be the same as defense. And it often is, but it isn't necessarily the same thing. So Switzerland has had a long policy of, if attacked, of blowing up its entire infrastructure, the roads, the bridges, the tunnels, which would make conquest time-consuming and expensive for the attacker. Switzerland was always too weak in the modern era to resist its neighbors, whether it was Nazi Germany or a Soviet invasion during the Cold War. But the benefits of conquering it were outweighed by the costs and the time and the effort to navigate through countless deep mountain valleys and other difficult terrain. So local deterrence is when you deter attacks upon oneself. So it's a dyadic relationship. One country tries to deter another. A successful demonstration of local deterrence, at least since 1965, the independence of Singapore, has been Singapore's defense. Singapore was expelled from Malaysia because it was seen as a socio-economic threat. And so the island had invested far more than its neighbors in national security. So in a country with a population of 4.1 million, it has 61,000 soldiers, which after full mobilization increased to 275,000. It has the largest tanks of all of Southeast Asia and a high-tech air force larger than the combined totals of its neighbors, plus a submarine force, marines, helicopters, rockets. Singapore's deterrent threat consists of a rapid mobilization and possible attack into its neighbors if it's threatened by invasion. There have been a couple of instances where it's been threatened by Indonesia directly for a payoff, and then Singapore signaled by mobilizing its forces. Singapore gets most, if not all, of its fresh water from a pipeline from Malaysia. And Singapore feels it has an obligation to protect the 15% of the Malaysian population that are Chinese. So Malaysia initiated an unannounced military exercise in one instance, and Singapore managed to complete a partial mobilization in only 24 hours. So it indeed has perhaps not the stamina for a long war, but if it had a conflict with Malaysia, it could probably penetrate into the peninsula about 100 kilometers before it was stopped. There are also cases of unsuccessful local deterrence. In 1967, Egyptian President Gamal Nasser deployed the Egyptian army in the Sinai in part to isolate Israel, which would have been disastrous for the Israelis because they depend on imports of food and fuel, and to simultaneously deter an attack on Egypt, which was maintaining the blockade. The Israelis, however, attacked and ultimately occupied the Sinai. Here you can see the road going through the Mitla Pass, where an Egyptian column has been trapped and bombed by the Israeli Air Force. Now, the main difference between local and extended deterrence is that while in local deterrence it's believable when a state claims to protect itself, there is, however, a credibility problem with respect to extended deterrence. When an ally is defended, the enemy may attack believing that the deterring state is not really serious about defending its ally. So we have the example of successful extended deterrence during the Cold War. The US put an enormous amount of military effort in terms of around $100 billion a year investment to signal to the Soviet Union that the US would act to protect West Germany against a Soviet invasion. And the Soviets seemingly believed this because the US committed a lot of soldiers and military force in West Germany, as well as nuclear weapons, and trained extensively, indicating that if the Soviet Union were to invade West Germany, it could not but end up fighting the American soldiers, which made the deterrence more credible. There are also unsuccessful cases of extended deterrence, or rather extended deterrence failures. Most famous case is, of course, June 25th, 1950, Communist North Korea chose to invade South Korea after consultation and encouragement by the leadership of both the Soviet Union and Communist China. The North Koreans had come to believe that the US had excluded South Korea from its global containment of communism. In a public presentation of the American security interests on January 12, 1950, US Secretary of State Dean Acheson inadvertently excluded South Korea and gave the communist states the erroneous impression that the US was not willing to defend South Korea from a communist invasion. Here you can see T-34-85 North Korean tanks and Kim Il-sung, the first leader. And you can also see on the right side American prisoners being taken by the North Korean invaders after they pushed south into the peninsula. A second famous case is when the president of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, invaded Kuwait on August 2nd, 1990. And he did this following and despite his meeting with U.S. Ambassador April Glaspie on July 23rd, 1990. And you can see here Glaspie in a picture shortly after the meeting in the bottom right. Glaspie's famous statement that, quote, "We have no opinion on the Arab-Arab conflicts like your border disagreement with Kuwait," close quote, was misinterpreted by Saddam Hussein that the U.S. would not act to protect Kuwait. So Saddam Hussein took this as an indication of basically a permission to reshape the borders of the Middle East. Now, the U.S.'s diplomatic signaling, however, tends to be most often misunderstood because the U.S. doesn't bluster. It's not very aggressive in its diplomacy because it's more often engaged in careful bargaining with very powerful states. And so the U.S. Didn't clearly say to Saddam Hussein not to invade Kuwait, but the U.S.'s disposition and April Glaspie's talk with Saddam Hussein gave the impression that the U.S. wasn't shifting policy. So it was a lack of communication. Now, deterrence is not a descriptive theory. It's actually the policy of keeping other states from attacking the state itself or its allies. It applies in cases in which one state has some interest or of conquering another, and does not apply to cases when two states are not caught in a confrontation. Here you can see the Panmunjom negotiating area between North and South Korea. So the 1965 Indo-Pakistan War, in which Pakistan attacked India after escalating from an operation in Kashmir, was not considered a deterrence failure by India because India had no actual public policy to openly deter Pakistan. India either ignored or gave very little attention to Pakistan. Their focus was on domestic politics and broader goals of international relations. So it could be argued there was no deterrence policy. I'm not sure if that's true. India had a military, and you have implied deterrence. At least you have implied defense when you have a military force. There is therefore a distinction to be made between two types of deterrence. Most of what we've talked about so far is immediate deterrence. This is when one state seeks to actively deter a threat from another. Immediate deterrence failure is an attack by one state on the deterring state. Now, general deterrence failure is somewhat more difficult to observe and measure. This is when two states are not in a confrontation because one state is so much weaker that there's not really an opportunity for an active confrontation. Now, immediate deterrence can turn into general deterrence, or vice versa, as power levels change. For example, the U.S. and Mexican enduring rivalry. Despite occasional wars between Mexico and the U.S., the most recent being General Pershing's retaliatory attacks in 1915 along their common border after Pancho Villa led an attack into an American town and killed some American citizens. The U.S. invaded and destroyed some towns along the frontier. And before that, the 1846 Mexican-American War, where the Americans landed on the east coast of Mexico and then marched into Mexico City. Mexico's weaker position today makes it virtually impossible for Mexico to do anything but be passive. So Mexico today does not invest in a large military or a large air force or a large navy, and does not even consider deploying intelligence assets or weapons against the U.S. because of general deterrent success. The U.S. is so powerful that Mexico does not even have a small chance of a successful confrontation over a dispute. Now, putting it in perspective, things can change. If there was a nuclear war between the U.S. and the USSR, and the U.S. was substantially destroyed in a nuclear strike, Mexico would then be in a much stronger position relative to the U.S. and might try to redress some of its losses. General deterrence matters because most nuclear weapons are designed for general deterrence, not immediate deterrence. To destroy Russia today, or the Soviet Union, in terms of its industry and its cities, probably only took about 500 nuclear weapons. But the U.S. had thousands more. The thousands of nuclear weapons are not meant to stop a war. You're going to kill about a third of the population just with 500 nuclear weapons. The additional weapons were meant to signal the country's commitment to having military power. And with that many nuclear weapons, it was simply impossible to catch up to the U.S. Between 1959 and 1961, the U.S. manufactured one thermonuclear warhead every 55 minutes. So you can imagine in just 2 or 3 weeks, it would have more weapons than France, and then another few weeks would have more nuclear weapons than the UK, and then a few more weeks, and it would have more nuclear weapons than every other country like South Africa, Israel, India, Pakistan. So the U.S. was so far ahead in terms of warheads, there was simply no opportunity for other countries to even compete. So that's the logic of general deterrence. General deterrence failure is when a country falls behind and it leads to the beginning of a confrontation. And we can see that emerging in perhaps the emerging hostility between China and Taiwan. Now, rational deterrence theory is the political science theory that is used to estimate when deterrence succeeds or fails. The theory was developed to help the U.S. policymakers in the 1950s and 60s to deploy nuclear weapons in a way that would enhance U.S. deterrence. And then it was later applied theoretically to all forms of deterrence. So rational deterrence theory is based on rational choice assumptions. It's very parsimonious. It basically has 3 necessary causes for deterrence to succeed. First, capability. The state must have enough nuclear forces to inflict unacceptable damage on the enemy. So the deterring state doesn't need a larger army than an enemy. It just needs to inflict a cost on the enemy that the enemy is not willing to suffer. This, of course, is very often not a known value. How much are people willing to suffer? People entered World War I in most of the Western states enthusiastic about getting into the war. But as the war dragged on, the losses exceeded any expectation, and most people were very hostile to continuing a sacrifice in the war. But once the sacrifices in the war, the number of dead, achieved a certain critical mass in each of the countries, people wanted revenge. And then the war continued. No one was willing to make peace. So what people are willing to suffer is a variable that changes according to many different circumstances, and very often leaders don't know what that value is. The second requirement is credibility. The enemy must believe that the state will use force. The U.S. feared that if they abandoned South Vietnam in the 1960s, and ultimately they did in 1972, it would be a signal to the Soviet Union that U.S. allies, particularly Europe, Japan, and the Middle East, were vulnerable. In fact, the opposite was true. When the U.S. pulled out of Vietnam, it looked like to the Soviets that the Americans were conserving their resources in order to protect those countries, and that there was therefore less of a threat against those countries. Now, during the Cold War, you can imagine there were questions by some Americans. If the Soviet Union were to drop a nuclear weapon on a city in West Germany, and then the U.S. were to retaliate, the Soviet Union would then fire a nuclear weapon at an American city. Is saving Hamburg worth the loss of New York City for the Americans? And those types of questions severely undermined the credibility of American deterrence. So the U.S., to enhance its security in Europe, used 2 techniques. First, the Americans created a credible commitment by burning the bridges. This is a metaphor. I really don't like metaphors, but this one was actually not a metaphor because it was frequently used in actual ancient battles. So this is the ancient practice of deploying an army and then burning the bridges so that the army would be trapped on the wrong side of the river. And so they would fight because they'd have no chance of retreat. So the soldiers would either fight or they were killed. So the Americans deployed a large force right up to the East German border along what's called the Fulda Gap, which is the shortest distance between East Germany and the Rhine crossing. And if the Soviets were to exploit that gap, which they would have to if they want to get around the Ruhr Valley or cross the Rhine, they would encounter the U.S. military. And those military forces, even if they're not there to defend Germany, would be there to defend themselves. So the Soviet Union couldn't avoid a fight with the U.S., and the U.S. couldn't avoid a fight with the Soviet Union. So this would enhance the commitment of the U.S. to defending West Germany. And if the Soviets were to go nuclear, the Americans had local nuclear weapons and they would escalate. The second metaphor is to lower the tripwire threshold to stop salami tactics. A salami tactic is, again, it's a metaphor for consuming a large object a bit at a time so as not to provoke a reaction. For example, let's say the Soviet Union, during the Cold War, seized a small portion of Norway, perhaps a square kilometer, in the middle of the Arctic. There's no one there. It's got, got a couple of Laplanders, but essentially low population density. If no one acted to stop the Soviet encroachment, then in the next month the Soviets would take more land and more land. Because who would want to start a nuclear war over some desolate piece of real estate north of the Arctic Circle? So a tripwire threshold is to put a force right up on that frontier. It's not a strong enough force to repel, but it's a strong enough force to notice the intrusion and then to escalate. So you're stopping the salami tactics, which is to take the larger salami a little slice at a time, by putting a tripwire. A small force that's not strong enough to win, but it indicates that there's been a transgression and a response is therefore required. So NATO's policy to counteract attempts by the Soviet Union under the wire was to deploy right up to the East German and the borders of other Warsaw Pact countries, typically with air cavalry forces and scout forces. The third requirement for rational deterrence theory that must be satisfied as a necessary condition is the deterrent threat must be communicated to the enemy or the enemy won't know, and the deterrence policy, of course, will not work. We saw that with April Glaspie failing to clearly threaten Saddam Hussein before his invasion of Kuwait, but we see it frequently. The British failing to deter Hitler in the 1930s, the British failing to outline that they would defend the Belgian port of Antwerp against the Germans in World War I. The failure of the British in the Falkland Islands to indicate that they would be committed to reconquering the islands if Argentina took the Las Malvinas. So you need communication. We also saw it in the case of India and Pakistan in 1965, where India claims they were trying to avoid a confrontation by not even discussing a military threat against Pakistan. All three of these must be present. If even one is missing, then deterrence may not succeed. There have been a lot of statistical studies that have been done to demonstrate that, in fact, rational deterrence theory does do a good job of predicting deterrence success. Nuclear weapons are enormously important because they are currently the most destructive military instrument of the great powers, and they shape peace as much as they would shape war. The history of U.S. nuclear thought began almost immediately after the American dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The debate opened up between Bernard Brodie, who was a naval historian who wrote the book The Absolute Weapon in 1946, and William Borden, who wrote a book There Will Be No Time, also in 1946, who worked within policy circles in Washington, D.C. Borden argued that nuclear weapons are simply bigger artillery. He's remembered by military specialists for his technically accurate predictions on missile developments. War is possible as long as leaders may come to believe that surprise is possible and inevitable between two great powers such as the US and the Soviet Union. War will involve simultaneous, rapid rocket attacks across great distances, but eventually technology would be developed to permit rockets and energy beams to shoot down other rockets. Surveillance and launch would be mostly automatic. Here you can see a US air-launched cruise missile. Key targets will be military, not cities, as precious nuclear resources will be used to destroy countervailing forces, or counterforce. In other words, targeting military assets. And cities will be left as hostages to the victor. The civilians will surrender when they lose the ability to fight. Why waste high-speed weapons against slow-moving targets like cities when slow attack systems such as bombers can deal with them later? Destroying New York City would not bring victory. City busting occurs after the battle is won. Industry does not matter because the speed of nuclear war relies on initial stockpiles and not ongoing production. Therefore, there should be no evacuation or dispersal of people from cities. The goal of nuclear war is to provoke the enemy to exhaust their own nuclear weapons on fortifications. Land armies would only be required in the unlikely outcome that the stalemate occurred, but this is unlikely. Missiles would be placed on dispersed submarines and ships, which would reduce the success of a first strike, and missiles would eventually replace bombers. Nuclear war is a tactical artillery exercise, and there is therefore no upper limit to the number of nuclear weapons required. Brody argued that nuclear weapons represented a fundamental change in international relations and war. He is strongly supported by academic proponents. He rejected the arguments of Borden. War is irrational because nuclear war will cause greater damage than any possible political gain except as a weapon of last resort against conquest. Nuclear weapons are strategic weapons, and they have transformed warfare because there is no defense against them, and therefore the destructions of one's cities are guaranteed. The focus, therefore, becomes one of avoiding the outbreak of war. Nuclear superiority is therefore non-existent. Nuclear weapons are difficult to locate, and therefore surprise does not matter. Retaliation also does not have to be guaranteed, just likely, in order to be deterrent. Sudden surprise attacks without prior indications of tensions also do not exist. Here you can see a US Skybolt missile probably being loaded on the B-52 also in the picture. We often make a distinction between conventional weapons and non-conventional deterrence. Conventional weapons are aircraft, tanks, and ships, versus non-conventional weapons, which are also termed weapons of mass destruction, which include toxicological weapons, biological weapons, chemical weapons, and finally nuclear weapons. In general, nuclear weapons are far more destructive than any of the other types of weapons of mass destruction. We've had significant experience of chemical weapons on the battlefield in the First World War, and there was significant planning for the use of chemical weapons dropped from the air in the 1930s leading up to the Second World War, but ultimately there was mutual deterrence. The British and Germans decided not to use chemical weapons against each other's cities. Now, nuclear weapons don't always deter. They will deter if they have second strike capability. In other words, if there's an attack on the nuclear arsenal, and the nuclear arsenal is able to survive because it's hidden, or because it's mobile, or because it's underwater, or because it's inside a missile silo that's very solidly resistant, then you have deterrence. Because then these missiles, even though they've been attacked, enough of them survive to be able to be fired back and cause unacceptable damage on the country that initially launched the missile attack. So second strike capability has many different technical ways of being achieved, but it's a requirement. If a country has nuclear missiles out in the open that can be attacked by a first strike, then not only does this arsenal not contribute to deterrence, but it actually creates instability. It creates circumstances which provokes the opponent to fire first, because you have a use it or lose it dilemma. Now, nuclear weapons have a crystal ball effect. The amount of damage they cause is far more obvious than conventional weapons or even chemical or biological weapons. And therefore, it's very easy for policymakers to understand the consequences of nuclear weapons. And the net consequence is nuclear deterrent forces tend both to deter crises from even occurring, and once they do occur, to stop their escalation and to de-escalate them before they become full-blown wars. While there were a number of confrontations and a major crisis in Cuba in 1962 between the United States and the Soviet Union, their mutual arsenals deterred each other from ever going to war. Now, nuclear weapons can contribute to instability, meaning they can give an incentive to one or the other party to using nuclear weapons that would lead to an outbreak of war, particularly if one or the other side lacks second strike capability. When one side has enough nuclear superiority to overcome the nuclear arsenal of the other, in other words, to destroy its arsenal in a first strike, and then has remaining weapons to threaten the other side, then you have instability, because one side has an incentive to attack the other. So the most stable relationship are two deterrent forces in which neither side has nuclear superiority. In general, it's very difficult to achieve nuclear superiority. You'd have to have an arsenal capable of simultaneously destroying missiles on bombers in the air, missiles dispersed at various airfields, missiles in silos, missiles on trucks and trains, and missiles underwater on submarines and on ships. And this is very difficult to coordinate. But if you do have two sides with nuclear weapons that have an unstable situation because they lack second strike capability, and this was the case with the US and the Soviet Union in the early 1950s, when most nuclear weapons were simply kept in garages on the surface at airfields, ready to be loaded onto bombers. This creates what's called the reciprocal fear of surprise attack. In other words, both of the countries, realizing there's instability, will take steps in order to fire their nuclear weapons first. And because each side is aware that the other side is trying to do this, there's a sudden fear of a surprise attack. And this can often escalate until one side feels the need to fire nuclear weapons to avoid being attacked first. Now, irrational leadership may also not be deterrable, even by nuclear weapons, although there's a very large debate as to what exactly it means to be irrational. States can actually pretend to be irrational. This is termed the rationality of irrationality. In a brinkmanship crisis where two countries are facing off against each other, it sometimes benefits one of the states to act a little bit crazy, because then it compels the other country to back down and to give concessions. But it's dangerous if both sides pretend to be irrational. Then any basis for negotiation falls apart, and you're risking, in effect, an acceleration towards a nuclear exchange. Another phenomenon is called perfect nuclear stability, also termed the stability-instability paradox. This is when you've got two nuclear arsenals with second strike that face off against each other, and the paradoxical outcome is they cancel each other out as if they never existed, with the effect that it looks like they make war safe at the lower conventional level. And there are two classic examples of this. In 1969, China confronted the Soviet Union on their common border. China had detonated a small nuclear weapon in 1964 and had accumulated a small arsenal. The Soviet Union had a very large arsenal in 1969. But with a minimal deterrent, China felt confident enough to challenge the Soviets conventionally. There was a border clash. The Chinese instigated an ambush against Soviet border troops. The Soviets then used artillery against Chinese ground forces. And it was shocking because it occurred between two major nuclear powers. And conventionally you would think, well, this could escalate to a nuclear war. But in fact, it was two nuclear arsenals that canceled each other out, making this conflict possible. The same phenomenon occurred in 1999. India and Pakistan had detonated nuclear weapons in 1998, and they then embarked on a conflict at the border at Kargil in Kashmir. Before this time, they had never engaged on this scale of a border conflict while they possessed nuclear weapons. So India and Pakistan hadn't actually exchanged this level of fighting since 1971. And then 1999, a year after the nuclear weapons were detonated, they confronted each other. So this is a paradoxical outcome, but some observers say that the stability-instability paradox does not exist. It's actually an illusion, and there are other domestic reasons why these countries clashed with each other and why the clashes didn't escalate. Another important observation is that there's a belief that you do not need large arsenals in order to deter. Some countries like France, England, and China have 300 nuclear warheads or less, and they feel confident. France was not able to destroy the Soviet Union during the Cold War. China would not be able to destroy the United States with its small arsenal, since most of those warheads can't even reach the United States. But having enough nuclear weapons to destroy the major cities of other countries seems to have a restraining effect. So even though China's got a small nuclear arsenal, they still behave like a great power. They still assert their interests. Now, there are technical problems that arise with nuclear arsenals. The first problem is the nuclear threshold credibility problem. If you have a large nuclear arsenal, but you don't have a very strong conventional force, then an adversary may try to exploit that difference by triggering a crisis at the conventional level. For example, North Korea invaded South Korea. South Korea was supported by the United States, which had a large nuclear arsenal. North Korea didn't have a nuclear arsenal. Only a year before, the Soviet Union had detonated a nuclear weapon in 1949. Certainly not a big arsenal to back North Korea. But the US conventional force was weak, so North Korea was encouraged to fight the United States. Now, the US faced the same problem in Europe a few years later. The United States and the Soviet Union had very large arsenals, and the Soviet Union had a very large army, but the US and NATO did not. So the solution here, in other words, to make credible the deterrent threat, is to introduce tactical nuclear weapons. In effect, to give nuclear weapons to the conventional armies. This is often called conventionalization. And what you can see here on the left is the Davy Crockett, which is the smallest nuclear launching system that the Americans deployed between the early 1970s to the early 1980s. And you can also see on the right a larger scale tactical battlefield nuclear system deployed by Pakistan. So in these cases, these countries can't be exploited, because if you were to attack them with your stronger conventional force, you would then face tactical nuclear weapons. In fact, half of all nuclear weapons ever manufactured were manufactured for tactical battlefield use, not city destruction. So these are atomic demolition munitions, which are backpack nukes, nuclear torpedoes, nuclear depth charges, nuclear air-to-air missiles, nuclear air-to-ground missiles, nuclear surface-to-surface missiles, nuclear artillery, a wide variety of systems. Another problem in the logic of nuclear deterrence is missile defense. Missile defense typically consists of interceptor rockets that would fly up into the sky and blow up incoming nuclear missiles. On its face, it looks like it's a purely defensive system. And defense is good. You're not attacking with a defense, and so in theory it should increase stability. So if you have a strong defense, then the enemy has no incentive to attack you. Here in the picture you can see the US interceptors at Fort Greely in Alaska. The other nuclear interceptor base the US has is at Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. So here's the problem. If the United States, for example, builds a missile defense, it actually creates instability. Because the Soviet Union looks at the missile defense and says, okay, here's an American missile defense. It's not going to shoot down all of our missiles, but it's going to shoot down enough of our missiles. So what if the US were to fire their nuclear missiles at the Soviet Union? It would come down and blow up a lot of Soviet nuclear missiles. And then whatever nuclear missiles the Soviets had that survived would then be fired back at the United States, but there'd be so few of them that they wouldn't get through the US missile defense system. So then the Soviet Union is thinking, well, you know what, we have to fire our nuclear weapons at the US before the US completes their missile defense system. And so the Americans get into the thinking, well, we know the Soviets are going to want to fire nuclear weapons at us before we finish our defense system, so we better fire our nuclear weapons now. So suddenly you have incentives for both sides to fire their nuclear weapons. This is completely counterintuitive for a defensive system. The solution arrived at by the Soviet Union and the United States was the ABM Treaty in 1972, where they both agreed to limit the ABM sites to 2. And then they had an amendment where it was limited to 1. And the Soviet Union put their missile defense around Moscow, where it is there today. And the Americans shut down their last remaining site as completely unnecessary. So missile defense actually creates instability, a very paradoxical and unexpected outcome. Now, we spoke before about the difference between immediate and general deterrence. General deterrence is when two states are not in confrontation, because one state is so much weaker than the other that there is no active confrontation. And I gave the example of the United States and Mexico. Mexico, its military power is significantly less than that of the United States. So there's not even a competition. Now, this actually has a special implication for nuclear weapons. The United States doesn't need more than, say, 100 nuclear weapons to destroy most of the cities in the Soviet Union that matter. After the main cities in the Soviet Union are destroyed, the cities get smaller and smaller and smaller to the point where you're attacking very small towns with nuclear weapons. And so the amount of destruction you're doing with every subsequent volley of nuclear weapons has a significant drop in what's called marginal returns. So why do the major powers have so many nuclear weapons? Well, the US doesn't have, or rather didn't have, thousands of nuclear weapons to deal with the Soviet Union. They probably had several thousands for tactical warfare purposes and extras, because many nuclear weapons would be destroyed during a nuclear exchange. But the US had a very large arsenal, primarily for the benefits of general deterrence, because the larger the US nuclear arsenal, the more confident were its allies, like Germany and Japan. So they would then not have to go and get their nuclear weapons. And a very large nuclear arsenal also deters other countries, like, for example, Mexico or Brazil. These countries might compete if the US only had 100 nuclear weapons. But ultimately, the US manufactured 71,000 nuclear weapons between 1945 and 1992. And the US is manufacturing one nuclear weapon every 50 minutes between 1959 and 1962, which in those 3 years, the US manufactured more nuclear weapons than every other country manufacturing nuclear weapons except the Soviet Union. So an enormous number. So nuclear general deterrence is a very important motive for countries having large arsenals. So we have some political science questions about nuclear weapons. Do they matter? Well, one, nuclear weapons prevent the conquest of the state. They don't stop attacks, even against nuclear-armed states. China attacked the United States in Korea between 1950 and 1953, at a time when the US had a much bigger arsenal than the Soviet Union, and China had no nuclear weapons at all. North Vietnam fought against the US for 8 years in Vietnam. Again, US had nuclear weapons, and the Soviet Union was not going to help North Vietnam in a nuclear war. The Soviet Union and China clashed in 1969. In 1973, Egypt and Syria attacked Israel, which had gotten its own nuclear weapons in about 1970, 1968, 1969. Egypt and Syria knew Israel had nuclear weapons, but they knew Israel couldn't use their nuclear weapons, not without being completely isolated. So Israel was in some sense completely trapped. Their nuclear weapons were not so much for destroying Egypt and Syria, because they couldn't use them until most of Israel was basically conquered by Egypt and Syria. Israel's nuclear weapons were to signal the rest of the world that it was going to go down with a fight and cause enormous disruption, and so other countries would have to save Israel. And again, Israel and Syria fought each other in Lebanon in 1982 and 1983. Argentina attacked the Falkland Islands, a possession of England, which had nuclear weapons. So there are a great many cases where nuclear weapons didn't deter. But they do appear to be weapons of last resort, which means if a country is about to suffer conquest, it may credibly fire off the nuclear weapons. But then that's a worrisome, because if you think about a country like North Korea, when the regime falls in a large demonstration, for example, might not the leadership, Kim Jong-un, or whoever's in charge in Pyongyang at the time, see no difference between the fall of a whole country and a fall just of their family that controls the Communist Party. Well, nuclear weapons also create security. I mean, they create a margin of safety for diplomacy. When countries have nuclear weapons, they feel less of a need to move first. There's more time for dialogue and interaction. And this is partially what happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis. You can also trade nuclear protection for benefits from allies. The U.S. provides protection to Japan. Japan supported U.S. foreign policy through huge amounts of development aid throughout the Cold War. The U.S. wanted an ally to help it reinforce the international trading system, and Japan was America's #1 ally for that. Nuclear weapons are incredibly cost effective. They free up resources. Nuclear weapons typically cost about 10 to 15% of a country's military budget. And even if you factor in cleaning up the environment decades later, it almost never exceeds 30% of a defense budget. So nuclear weapons are incredibly cheap for what they do. Nuclear weapons also have swagger appeal. They bring status. It's not mere coincidence that the 5 Security Council veto powers, the United States, Russia, China, England, and France, all have the ability to mass produce thermonuclear weapons. Now, it's believed that India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea can probably manufacture a thermonuclear weapon in a laboratory setting, but they're not in a position to mass produce them like the 5 major Security Council veto powers. Now, there are some dangerous illusions about nuclear unusability. Some argue that nuclear weapons have made war unthinkable. This was actually stated by Nobel, who invented TNT. He thought TNT is so destructive, we'll never have war again. But of course there was war. It was thought that after chemical weapons were used in World War I, having another war would be unthinkable. But World War II happened, and Hitler and Churchill and Stalin simply agreed not to use chemical weapons. Others argue that common problems like the environment are going to compel countries to cooperate between each other. But natural disasters in the past, like drought, haven't always brought countries together, but have allowed one country to exploit another. Others have argued that economic interdependence has made it far less likely that countries would embark on a nuclear war. But in 1913, Germany and England traded more with each other than they would until 1970. In fact, Norman Angell, who's shown here in the bottom left, argued that war was very unlikely because of the level of economic interdependence. His prediction was proved false within a year. Countries, if they feel insecure, will always sacrifice their economic health in order to get more security. So there are risks associated with exercising the use of nuclear weapons. The first is that if nuclear weapons are used, or a country threatens to use nuclear weapons too visibly, then it could accelerate nuclear proliferation. The problem is countries may realize that nuclear weapons are relatively easy to manufacture, very powerful on the battlefield, and very cost effective. And therefore other countries would then want nuclear weapons. One of the biggest restraints on not using nuclear weapons and not threatening countries with nuclear attack in diplomacy is the concern that the major powers like the US and the Soviet Union would have their power eroded by other countries rapidly acquiring nuclear weapons. So it is in the interest of the large nuclear powers not to actually exercise nuclear diplomacy. Now, for most states, only state survival is worth the cost of risking a nuclear war. However, a state may believe in the domino theory, the theory that the failure to defend a particular interest will result in a subsequent cascade failure of all interests, because if a state concedes on one dispute, it's expected to be weak and will be challenged shortly after on other disputes. So states may put all of their power to defend the first issue. So for example, Taiwan poses a legitimacy threat to China because it's an alternate form of government that is an incredible threat to the legitimacy of the Communist Party in Beijing. So China may invade and try to seize Taiwan, and the United States might stop Taiwan, arguing that Taiwan is a fellow democracy. And this war may escalate. If China backs down, then they're going to be taken advantage of, and the Communist Party will be targeted and overthrown like almost every other Communist Party has been. If the US backs down, it'll be a signal for Communist China to expand beyond Taiwan. So both sides might deploy tactical nuclear weapons. They might use tactical nuclear weapons. They might threaten to use theater weapons. They might escalate from tactical to theater applications of nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapon detonations under the oceans, in space, and they may ultimately escalate to nuclear war between each other's heartlands. Now there's a large normative debate about nuclear proliferation. Normative means, what do you want to have happen? In other words, what's the norm or the value? There's been a lot of effort invested in anti-proliferation or non-proliferation arms control, including the Partial Test Ban Treaty, the Outer Space Treaty, the 1968 Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Nuclear Suppliers Group, the Strategic Arms Limitations Talks, the Missile Technology Control Regime. All of these are designed to stop the spread of nuclear technology, missiles, nuclear weapons, and where nuclear weapons are deployed or used. There are nuclear-free weapon zones. The great powers during the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union, signed arms control agreements, the SALT talks, the START talks, to limit the rapid growth in the size of arsenals of the different sides. It's believed that if there are too many nuclear weapons, or nuclear weapons of the wrong type, or if nuclear weapons are deployed in unstable fashion, eventually nuclear weapons will be used with catastrophic consequences. In 1982, Kenneth Waltz wrote an Adelphi paper entitled "More May Be Better," where he argued, since nuclear weapons are such a powerful deterrent, that they compel even politically radical regimes to moderate themselves, partially because to develop nuclear weapons you must have a certain amount of administrative maturity, but also once you possess nuclear weapons you understand their destructiveness and you generally become more restrained. And nuclear weapons make nuclear weapon states feel more secure. So radical communist Soviet Union, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, actually calmed down and became almost a status quo power. Communist China, that was asking the Soviet Union to immediately provoke a nuclear conflict over the 1954 and 1958 Taiwan Straits crisis, itself in the 1970s became restrained after the Cultural Revolution. So Kenneth Waltz seems to be right. All of these nuclear weapon states, once they acquire nuclear weapons, eventually moderate themselves, like India and Pakistan. And Kenneth Waltz makes the same prediction for North Korea. It's a compelling argument. Either you believe Kenneth Waltz, which is that nuclear weapons are incredibly robust, almost unusable, and therefore you would not have countries with nuclear weapons start deadly wars against each other. So allowing nuclear proliferation should create world peace. Or you believe the arms control community, who think more nuclear weapons are disastrous. Although the arms control community can't precisely explain how they see nuclear deterrence failing and a nuclear war breaking out. So what are some of the criticisms of rational deterrence theory? Well, there's been a lively debate since the 1970s on the usefulness and correctness of deterrence theory, using both statistical and case study methods. And so there's a number of issues that need to be addressed. First of all, there's no way to tell whether one state did not attack another because it was successfully deterred or because it simply didn't want to attack. Did NATO, for example, during the Cold War successfully deter a Soviet and Warsaw Pact on Europe? Or were the Soviets never interested in conquering Western Europe? Yes, the Soviet tanks were designed for offensive operations. But, think of Russian history. They were attacked by the Swedes, and finally the Swedes were ejected at the Battle of Poltava. Russia was invaded by Napoleon, which must have killed several hundred thousand, if not 1 million Russians. The Soviet Union Russia was attacked by the Wilhelmine Germans in World War I. In World War II, Hitler attacked with a genocidal plan. And even though Hitler was defeated, he killed 20 to 27 million Russians. So maybe the Soviet Union created the Warsaw Pact as a belt, both an ideological belt, so that Soviet communism didn't have to confront Western consumerism, but also as a geographic belt against a possible attack in the future by the West. So with deterrence theory, we must always compare the explanation with probable alternative explanations to be certain. To solve this, we can use counterfactual analysis. Would the Soviet Union have attacked West Germany if NATO had never been created? Obviously, this is a difficult problem to solve. Counterfactuals have a lot of pitfalls that we need to address, make sure they're co-tenable with reality. But this is an application of counterfactuals. A second issue is that deterrence does not always explain many important cases because it cannot explain risk-taking. Here you can see chemical weapons. For example, in 1904 and 1905, Japan, which was then in the process of industrializing, attacked Russia and established large military power. Russia had more available military forces and resources. Russia demonstrated its willingness to be involved in very large wars. For example, Russia was instrumental in defeating Napoleon at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Russia had warned Japan against too much encroachment in China. But Japan, feeling that if it didn't stand up to Russia in Korea and China, it would forever be a minor country, chose to attack. So it attacked the Russian fleet in Port Arthur, which can be seen in the map on the left, and advanced an army into Korea to confront the Russian forces in Manchuria. In 1941, Japan had the same set of choices. The U.S. embargoed Japan's oil because Japan was slowly occupying the coastal areas of China. And so China had a choice. Either it pull out of China or it go to war. So China risked going to war. The U.S. economy was 7 times larger than Japan. The U.S. had almost twice the population of Japan. So the Japanese calculated that other things being equal, they would probably lose the war. But they thought there was a possibility that made the gamble worthwhile, that they could win. Now, Professor T.V. Paul at McGill developed a theory to explain these paradoxical deterrence failures, where a weaker state attacks a more powerful state. Rational deterrence theory is rational and therefore doesn't account for variables like domestic calculations, where leaders go to war because they think if they don't, they'll lose their power domestically. Or misperception, where leaders misunderstand the deterrence stance of the other countries. Or irrational behavior, especially risk-prone behavior. Japan in 1941 understood that the U.S. was much stronger, just as it had known that Russia was stronger in 1904. It also received threats in both cases. It confronted a Russian fleet at Port Arthur in 1904 and an American fleet at Pearl Harbor in 1941. However, the Japanese leadership calculated that both Russia and the U.S. were afraid of suffering high losses, and they were distracted by other events. The Russians were distracted by a failed revolutionary behavior by its domestic population, and the US was gazing towards Europe in the 1940s as the Germans were slowly defeating countries there. So the US didn't want to be distracted. The Japanese calculated that if they struck quickly and overwhelmingly, they could force a negotiation. Against Russia, it worked. Russia refocused on domestic politics and it conceded to Japan. In 1941, the Japanese attack was disastrous. Ultimately, the Germans were defeated in Europe, and the US was able to shift a significant amount of the resources against Japan. So Japan's calculation bias can be explained by prospect theory. This is a theory of behavior at risk. Japan significantly exaggerated the extremely small likelihood of success in both cases. They managed to pull it off against Russia, but not against the US. So in 1904, Japan assaulted the Russian base at Port Arthur and then destroyed the Russian relief fleet at Tsushima in 1905, causing the Russians to sue for peace before the Russian mobilization for war was ready. If the Russians had decided to commit to the mobilization, the army would have been large enough coming down the Trans-Siberian Railway that it would have eventually destroyed the Japanese army in Manchuria. In 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, crippling the US fleet, and then sought a major battle to destroy the remainder of the US fleet. But the US never gave Japan the opportunity. At the Battle of Midway in 1942, the US decisively defeated the Japanese fleet by sinking 4 major fleet carriers. And after that, Japan lost the initiative, and it was just a matter of time before they were isolated and surrendered. So one conclusion is that rational deterrence theory cannot explain deterrence failure in crises, because particularly in a crisis, you have intense cognitive and psychological biases that are being suffered by the decision makers. The third consideration is that rational deterrence theory is also static in that it assumes a given deterrence challenge can be explained without regard to earlier deterrence failures or successes. Remember our discussion about enduring rivalries. Russell Lang has done a statistical study and concluded that a deterrent success in one instance increases the likelihood of war in the future because on average it hardens the deterrer's resolution and emboldens the challenger to be more bold. So if you win in a deterrence confrontation, the lesson in the future is to be more aggressive. If you lose in a deterrence confrontation, the message is to be more aggressive next time. We're going to look later at arms races, where we're going to see the application of crises and enduring rivalries in the context of arms competitions. Now, Mearsheimer is a professor at the University of Chicago, and he did some case study work on conventional deterrence. And Mearsheimer's principal argument is that the type of doctrine, military doctrine, explains conventional deterrence failure. So states that have blitzkrieg and limited gains strategies will be difficult to deter and are therefore more likely to go to war. And so he has a basic deterrence calculus, which is that deterrence is enhanced by increasing the cost, the time, and the probability, rather reducing the probability of success of the attacker. So to get a grip on this hypothesis, we're going to define some terms. So there are 4 defensive strategies that a state can form. There's first of all the static defense. This relies on fixed defensive positions around key locations within friendly territory. Here you can see it in the form of a pillbox. The advantage is it's very hard to defeat directly. It takes a lot of resources to overcome fortifications. The disadvantage is that it's very easy to bypass and it encourages limited gains attacks. So if you have a fortification, someone could attack and just capture a small piece of your territory that's distant from wherever the fortification is. An example was the Russian defense at the beginning of the Second World War. Stalin had purged a large part of the Soviet army, the leader of the Soviet Union, and he deployed a thin layer of Russian soldiers without much depth right up to the German part of Poland and the border of East Prussia. And this made Russia vulnerable to being exploited. And here you have German soldiers who bypassed the Russian army and led to millions of soldiers being taken prisoner. The second type of defense is the forward defense. This is deployment of strength forward. Now the advantage is that you deploy the maximum strength forward and it deters limited gains attacks. The disadvantage is it's very easy to bypass because once you get through the front line, the rear area is completely undefended. So this is what happened to the French in 1940. A part of the deal plan, the French had the Maginot Line in 1939 along the German-French border, but there was no Maginot Line from the Luxembourg and Belgian border with France. And so the French and English armies deployed there and they swung into Belgium. But then the Germans were able to break through the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg and penetrate at the hinge after crossing the Meuse River. And here you can see the arrow that goes through the Ardennes, the dashed one with the little dots, the black dots on white. And this is the Germans breaking through the hinge between the Maginot Line and the advancing French and English armies into Belgium. And this led to the trapping of the English army and the French army and subsequently the Dunkirk evacuation. There were no forces in the rear because all the forces were deployed to the front. The third type of defense is the defense in depth. And here you have a lower density of soldiers that are right up to the front of the border, but they're also deployed into the rear. So the advantage is that it's very good at slowing down fast-moving, deep-penetrating attackers, like a blitzkrieg, for example, because they're constantly having to be on guard. A supply truck, which would carry gasoline and food, driving behind an advancing army, needs to be protected, even against a soldier with a single rifle. So having a thin layer of soldiers means you're not very strong at the front, but you're able to interdict all sorts of maneuvers by an attacker in the rear. Now the disadvantage is that there's not enough force at the front, so it leaves a country vulnerable to a limited gains attack because you don't have enough force deployed at the front. This was the Soviet defense at the Battle of the Kursk, which at that time was the largest tank battle in history. So in 1943, the Germans attacked the Russian city of Kursk from the north and the south, and the Soviets prepared multiple layers of defense in depth, knowing that if the Germans got into the rear, they would have a free run of the country. So instead of having a large number of forces deployed forward, the Russians had this layered defense, which slowed down and eventually attrited the German forces to a standstill, and then ultimately the Russians were able to conduct a counteroffensive and defeat the German attack. The mobile defense is the fourth type of defense. This is the use of highly mobile armored forces to intercept attacking forces. The advantage is it permits blocking and counterattacking of the enemy. So you meet them where they are. You stop them in their tracks, wherever they are, in depth or at the front. The disadvantage is it's very hard to show up at the right place and at the right time unless you have absolutely brilliant intelligence. Some countries train for this. The West Germans focused heavily on mobile defense. In other words, local counterattacks. The West Germans had plans to confront the East Germans right up to the East German border and to drive around the East Germans and the attacking Soviet forces. This required extensive training by low-level leaders to be able to coordinate operations on an ad hoc and hasty fashion. Now there are three attacker strategies that you can choose from for conquest. The first is attrition. Here you use attacking forces in such a way as to inflict losses on the enemy. The attacker basically accepts losses in a favorable ratio to the defending forces. Well, the advantage is that it's got a low risk of defeat. The disadvantage is that it's costly, and not all countries want to engage in this kind of attack. This is basically the character of the Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988. Iran had lost much of the technical skill in the process of the revolution that it had acquired with large arms purchases. And so it had a very low-risk strategy of simply attritioning the Iraqis in constant battles. Iran accepted the higher losses, but they also led to high confidence that they couldn't be surrounded or defeated. The second type of attack is the blitzkrieg. Now, it's a German word for lightning war, but this was not a word invented by the Germans. It was invented either by American journalists or by Italian journalists. The Germans called their form of warfare combined arms maneuver warfare. Basically, you have soldiers trained to maneuver and to cooperate while they're maneuvering, which is incredibly difficult. Getting artillery and armored and infantry and engineers and anti-tank and air defense and air support people to understand each other professionally when they have such very different types of technological training is difficult. So we're going to use the term blitzkrieg here, but I don't want you to think that we imply German mode of warfare. We're really just discussing maneuver attacks. So blitzkrieg is the penetration of the enemy along a narrow front and breakthrough into the enemy's vulnerable rear. And there you can destroy their supply, their command and reserve formations, and the conquest of unoccupied territory. The advantage is when it works, you have an incredible payoff. Like you saw earlier, the initial attack by the Germans on the Soviet Union in 1941, the German attack on France in 1939, which led to the British evacuation at Dunkirk. And here you can see a more detailed depiction of the German advance into the English and French rear in 1939, which led to the defeat of the French. It was fantastically successful. The Germans lost only 40,000 killed, although it was a very, very tough fight. And they achieved victory in 6 weeks, which was a remarkable victory compared to the First World War, where Germany never conquered France. Now, the disadvantage is that it's very costly if there's a failure. Here's an example which you might have seen in a movie like The Bridge Too Far. The British landed airborne troops at a series of bridges and cities leading over the Rhine from Belgium to Holland. And this would have allowed the British Army to get around the Rhine River defenses and to get into Germany and end the war early. But because the Germans were able to hold the very last bridge, the British ended up controlling a salient, which was very vulnerable, and they were never able to achieve a breakthrough. And so the idea was a heavy initial cost, with airborne troops being dropped and tank forces advancing along roads in basically marshy terrain of Belgium and Holland. But ultimately, because the Germans stopped the Allies suffered enormous costs and never got the operational payoff. Here you can see a painting depicting the fighting around Arnhem Bridge. So blitzkrieg depends on open territory. It depends on working against an enemy that's not too densely deployed. Usually there's only one chance to get it right, and when it fails, it normally turns into an attrition attack. So blitzkriegs turn into attrition attack, which is what happened to the Germans in their invasion of the Soviet Union. Ultimately, it became a war of attrition, and Germany was put on the defensive. The third kind of attack is the limited aims attack. This is an attack which uses terrain and surprise to avoid the defender's main force. Because the goal here is not to defeat the enemy army, but to capture a limited territorial objective and establish a fait accompli politically, that the defender then cannot alter. The advantage is that it permits capture of poorly defended territory, because the defender's army can't be everywhere at once if they don't have a static defense in the area, or they're not forward deployed, or they don't have good enough intelligence to do a mobile defense against the attack. The disadvantage is it doesn't work if the enemy responds. In 1956, the Israelis attacked into the Sinai, and the goal was undertaken to destroy the Egyptian army and to annex the Sharm el-Sheikh, which is the very southern tip of the Sinai, from which the Egyptians could have blockaded Israel. And you can see a close-in of the Sharm el-Sheikh Strait in the top right of the picture. Now, there was no intention by Israel to conquer Egypt, and the attack was conducted by bypassing most of the Egyptian forces in the Sinai in order to capture the territory, because the territory was seen as strategic. In the fight in Kargil between India and Pakistan, in the mountains of Kashmir, the Pakistani goal was to seize these peaks, because these peaks were at enormous elevations, very difficult for people to breathe at that altitude. And they're completely covered by snow in the winter. So in the spring, when the snow's melted, the Pakistanis occupied the peaks before the Indians were able to. But India then fought to eject the Pakistanis from those peaks. The Pakistanis had hoped to seize the peaks and then to achieve a political fait accompli. But India paid the military price in order to have Pakistan's soldiers there ejected. So here's the graph of that representation. You can see on the left side the 3 forms of attacks, and you can see on the top side the 4 forms of defense, and we can go through each of these. And we'll start on the top left. So the attrition versus static basically results in no war, because someone seeking an attrition conflict, unless they're overwhelmingly strong, are going to pay a very long price. Attrition against a forward attack, which is the next one to the right, also is not likely to lead to war. An attrition against in-depth, well, it's not militating against war, because the attacker is going to pay a lower price, but you can always shift from an in-depth defense to a forward defense if the attacker insists on engaging in attrition. And then you're back to not going to war. You're not likely to get an attrition war if the enemy that you're attacking is very mobile, especially if they're strong. If they're weak, they can be overwhelmed. But if they're strong, they're basically going to circle around your attrition force. Now, going back to the left, the blitzkrieg row. If you have a static force, the blitzkrieg maneuver warfare is just going to move around it. If you have a forward defense, the blitzkrieg is going to look for a hole, a gap, penetrate it, and go into the rear. So in both the blitzkrieg versus static and blitzkrieg versus forward, the incentive is for the attacker to attack. They have a tactical advantage or an operational advantage. Now, blitzkrieg against in-depth, this is the worst case for blitzkrieg. Blitzkrieg needs open fields and open roads to drive down. After driving for 3 days, even if the opposition is not heavy, if it's slight, you're going to be severely slowed down. Tanks need gasoline. Gasoline comes from vulnerable trucks. And someone with a sledgehammer can disable a truck. You don't need a piece of artillery. And then blitzkrieg versus mobile. Again, it depends how efficient the mobile defender is. On the bottom row, we have limited gains. If you're doing a limited gains attack against a static force, you have an incentive, because the static force is probably not located in the area where you want to go, although it might be. Limited gains against a forward defense will fail. You're putting strength against strength, and right up on the piece of geography you want to capture, you're going to find a force. Limited gains against in-depth could work, because in-depth is going to be lower level of density of defense, and so you might be able to capture the piece of territory and then force a political fait accompli. And limited gains against mobile, well, it depends how good the mobile defense is. So Mearsheimer argued that deterrence is most likely to fail under 2 circumstances. 1, when the attacker has a blitzkrieg strategy and the defender has a static or forward defense. Again, Germany invaded and conquered France in 1940 in 6 weeks with only 40,000 deaths by driving behind French forces. The second circumstance is when the attacker has a limited gain strategy and the defender has either a static or a defense in depth. And this is Pakistan's attack into Kashmir in 1965. It sought to conquer the territory before the Indian army could react. Instead, India escalated and started to counterattack around the Hajipir Pass. And then Pakistan retaliated in Jammu with an armored force. And then India attacked Pakistan proper by invading towards Lahore. So the war quickly escalated. Now, the main problem of the theory is that Mearsheimer is begging the question. If blitzkrieg strategies lead to war, then Mearsheimer should provide a theory that predicts when do states adopt blitzkrieg strategies. Here, a strategy is an intervening variable. We want to know what caused the country to achieve the blitzkrieg. Because there are cases where countries adopt blitzkrieg, and then they do it very, very poorly, and then they're defeated. The early counterattacks by the Soviet Union against Germany after their invasion of the Soviet Union are examples of this. The Soviet blitzkrieg operations were poorly conceived and poorly executed and resulted in disasters. So it's not what strategy a country selects. It's whether it's why they selected that strategy. Now we have a case of the Arab-Israeli War of October 1973. It's alternately called the Yom Kippur War or the Ramadan War because it took place during those religious celebrations. This case provides a good example of the application of the logic and the criticisms of deterrence theory. This is a case of deterrence failure, where after a profound defeat by the victory by the Israelis in 1967, defeating its frontline Arab adversaries, 6 years later, those Arab states attacked Israel. So the background is in June of 1967, Israel attacked Egypt, Syria, and Jordan and captured the Golan Heights on the Syrian border, the West Bank, formerly controlled by Jordan, and the Sinai from Egypt. And you can see here the change in the real estate control on the lower right-hand side. On the left side, you can see the coalition in 1967 and how Israel went from that smaller territory to the larger territory. Well, the impact of that defeat on the frontline Arab states was an immediate military buildup with the help from the Soviet Union. Although resupply efforts were restrained by Brezhnev's fear that the Arab states would attack again, and this would bring the Soviet Union into an open confrontation with the US. Jordan resigned itself to defeat, never to recapture the West Bank, and Syria began retraining its army. In Egypt, President Gamal Nasser offered to resign, but his widespread nationalist support and pan-Arab appeal permitted him to transfer the blame to the Egyptian army. There followed a purging and transformation of the Egyptian army into a more professional force. In 1969, Egypt began a war of attrition across the Suez Canal against the Israelis, and it ended up with high losses to both sides by 1970. Egypt would shell Israeli positions and send commandos against the Israeli Bar-Lev line in the Sinai, while the Israelis conducted commando raids and airstrikes against Egypt. The relatively low-cost victory for Israel in June of 1967 transformed the main goals of Israel's foreign policy. Originally, Israel's goal was to trade land for peace, or basically to seize land and to hold it hostage until Israel's neighbors granted it recognition. This was the policy in 1956, but it didn't work because the US intervened and compelled Israel to leave the Sinai. After the 1967 victory, Israel adopted a delaying tactic in negotiations. It came to believe that its vast military superiority would permit it to rely on that for its security, and that there was therefore no need to trade the land for peace. Rather, it could use the land as a buffer zone. So before 1967, Israel's defense strategy consisted of surprise attack on its enemies before they are ready to attack. Essentially a blitzkrieg and limited attack strategy. In 1948, 1956, and 1967, Israel always managed to attack before the frontline Arab states were able to organize their attack. Israel failed to detect the Egyptian buildup in the Sinai in 1960, and this scared the Israelis into improving their intelligence gathering capabilities. After 1967, the newly captured territories permitted Israel to shift from a strategy of attack to one of forward defense. Instead of relying on preemption strikes, Israel relied on a defense line built in the Sinai called the Bar-Lev line. In the Golan, Israel relied on the Jordan River to stop any Syrian attack into northern Israel. During the War of Attrition in 1969 and 1970, the Bar-Lev line permitted Israel not to lose any land to threatened Egyptian commando attacks. After 1970, Israel calculated from a deterrent standpoint that it could deter any Arab attack at least until into the 1980s. Here you can see Golda Meir, the Israeli Prime Minister during the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. So Israel's deterrence calculations were as follows. In terms of capability, Israel calculated that on the basis of the performance of the Arab armies in 1967, that there was simply no way Egypt or Syria could conquer Israel or even reoccupy the land they lost in 1967, specifically the Golan Heights and the Sinai. Israel's military was a magnitude too strong. Its skill in the use of air power and maneuver warfare far outstripped the Arabs with their less technically well-educated militaries. In terms of credibility, Israel indicated in the past numerous times that it would match Arab attacks, whether conventional invasions to sponsoring infiltration attacks by militants, and that it would respond disproportionately to increase the cost on the frontline Arab supporters of these attacks. Israel concluded that it won the war of attrition through massive bombing of military and civilian targets that incurred at least 6,000 Egyptian deaths, and that Egypt would be unwilling to suffer the same level of punishment again. In terms of communication, Israel frequently threatened the frontline Arab states severe retaliation for attacks on Israel at all levels of threat. Now, there were two institutional consequences of this overconfidence on Israel's part. One, Israel stopped developing its military doctrine, believing that whatever brought it success in 1967 would bring it victory in the future. Although Israel's intelligence services were unaffected, its frequent warnings were interpreted by senior military and political leaders as false alarms. And so they systematically underestimated the potential strength of the Egyptian and Syrian armed forces, and the Israeli public was convinced that there was no military threat to Israel. This is Moshe Dayan, the Israeli defense minister in the 1967 war. When Nasser died in 1970, Anwar Sadat, the vice president who took over, began planning a military operation with loose consultation with President Hafez Assad of Syria. Very quickly, the Egyptian planners realized that Egypt and Syria were rather weak compared with Israel. And this was not helped by the fact that the Soviet Union did not want to provide much help. Furthermore, sometime in the late 1960s, early 1970s, Israel managed to weaponize its nuclear capability that it had been working on for the previous 2 decades. So Israel had nuclear weapons, and this was known both to Egypt and to Syria. But the nuclear weapons Israel had were probably fission weapons. They were probably not numerous, and therefore they didn't deter Egypt and Syria from engaging in their military planning. Hafez Assad of Syria was a relatively reliable ally of the Soviet Union, and therefore between 1967 and 1973, Syria received Soviet advisors that radically transformed the military. And Syria received around 2,500 tanks and aircraft, as well as ground-based missile systems that neutralized Israel's air force. The Soviet Union needed to keep Egypt from drifting towards the US, and therefore, despite Sadat expelling most Soviet advisors, he too was able to negotiate about 2,500 tanks, aircraft, and a missile system to neutralize the Israeli air force. Here you can see Shazli, who's the Egyptian operations officer that planned the crossing of the Suez Canal by the Egyptian forces and the attack by the Egyptians on the Israelis. Here you can see Egyptian soldiers in an entrenchment. So Hafez Assad of Syria wanted to recapture the Golan Heights only, and therefore prepared his plans to overrun the Israeli defenders, but then to stop short of the Jordan River. This was in part because to attack into Israel would have probably provoked the Israelis to have a nuclear response. Hafez Assad obtained from the Soviets a promise that they would intervene before the Israeli counterattack, and thus the heights would be recaptured. However, Assad could not conduct the attack alone and required the Egyptians to at least distract the Israelis in the Sinai. The scale of the distraction would require an Egyptian attempt to recapture the entire peninsula of the Sinai. So here you can see the Sinai, and on the left you can see the territory captured by the Egyptians when they crossed. Egypt and Syria were nominal allies, but Sadat blamed Syria for the 1967 war and was therefore ready to manipulate Syria. The Egyptian general stated that an occupation of the Sinai was impossible because Egypt's missiles had limited range and therefore could not neutralize the Israeli air force too far into the Sinai. So the Egyptians and the Syrians compromised that the Egyptians would attack all the way to the passes, the Jideh and the Mitla Pass, which can be seen in the map, in the sort of the western portion of the Sinai in the north, and attack all the way to the passes in the central western part of the Sinai. Sadat had ordered his military to lie, as the Egyptian plans were simply to cross the canal and recapture the Bar-Lev line and then stop. Here you can see a depiction of the Golan Heights. You can see in the top right the relative elevations and why the Golan Heights gave Israel an advantage of protection against artillery. You can see in the lower right the Golan Heights relative distance from the Syrian capital at Damascus. And on the left, you can see the United Nations buffer zone between the Syrian and the Israeli parts of the Golan Heights. Now, the Egyptian plan revolved around two assumptions. One, the U.S. would do almost anything to bring Egypt out of the Soviet orbit. The Egyptians calculated that if Egypt got the U.S.'s attention and drifted away from the Soviets, the U.S. would force a ceasefire on Israel. And two, the Israelis were overconfident and that a single battlefield defeat would shake their confidence enough to force them to the negotiating table with Egypt. So that was therefore seeking a political rather than a military strategy. This is important because it affects his calculations about what is considered victory. So the war was initiated by Egypt and Syria on October 6, 1973. Syrian and Egyptian forces attacked Israel with substantial surprise. After 3 weeks of war, at tremendous cost in lives and material to all sides, Israel was able to push the Syrians back and to cross the Suez Canal into African Egypt. Without threats of Soviet intervention, Israel could have achieved a decisive military defeat of Egypt. So here you can see on the left, you can see the Egyptian crossing of the canal and then the Israeli counterattack up to the canal. But it doesn't show the Israelis crossing north of the Great Bitter Lake at Dever and then their drive in the area between Cairo and the canal. On the right, you can see in black the original Syrian attack and then the Israeli counterattack, which then pushed towards Damascus but stalled. So here you can see now on the left where the Israelis crossed over the canal. The Israelis had pre-sighted crossing points, and there were multiple choices for them to do the crossing, and so they were able to get around Egyptian forces, and there was very little Egyptian force in depth, and so they were able to get around the forces and then isolate an Egyptian army. On the right, you can see the Israeli plan to drive towards Damascus and then to isolate it. But the attack failed because of the volcanic rock, which limited Israeli mobility. So the Israelis were satisfied with simply bringing Damascus within range of their long 175mm artillery pieces. So what were the results of the 1973 October War? Well, the Israeli population was shocked by the losses. They were surprised by the attack and angry at the overconfidence of the Israeli government that led to a series of political resignations and ultimately the Agranat Commission that led to further resignations in the military and the intelligence services. Israel was compelled by domestic politics into negotiations with Egypt that resulted in the return of the Sinai to Egypt, Egypt's recognition of Israel, and the entry of Egypt into the U.S. camp. Syria refused to negotiate on the U.S.'s terms and was therefore locked out of any agreement. Here you can see either a Syrian or an Egyptian surface-to-air missile moments before it damaged an Israeli aircraft. So, assessment. What was wrong with Israel's deterrent calculation? For Mearsheimer, war was made more likely because Israel had become reliant on a forward defense in the Golan Heights and the Sinai, and Egypt and Syria made use of a combination of blitzkrieg and limited aims attacks. Israel also calculated across the three necessary factors in deterrence. In terms of capability, Israel was correct in its calculation that it was far stronger in a conventional conflict with Egypt and Syria. However, it did not calculate whether Israel's deterrent stance would inflict a sufficient cost on Egypt and Syria to deter a limited attack, such as the one restricted only to the Golan and the Sinai. Israel did not realize that what was being attacked was not its military, but its domestic political situation and its link with the U.S. Number two, credibility. Israel was revealed to be casualty sensitive because of relatively smaller population as compared with its neighbors. Israel was exposed to be unwilling to be locked into a long state of war with Egypt. Number three, communications. Well, Israel's communication was appropriate. It constantly threatened retaliation against attack by frontline Arab states. So according to rational deterrence theory, what should Israel have done? Well, Israel should, one, not have been so publicly overconfident by properly estimating Egyptian and Syrian goals. And number two, militarily, any move towards another strategy would have encouraged a war of attrition.